In Nanjing, during the Japanese invasion of 1937, thousands of prisoners and civilians were executed without exception. Among them stood out an officer whose saber became an instrument of extermination. More than 300 men were beheaded in a matter of weeks under his hand as violence swept through the occupied city. The orders were clear. No trace of resistance should remain. The prisoners were gathered, forced to kneel, and killed en masse with rifles, bayonets, or sword strikes. Violence ceased to be an isolated excess and became an accepted mechanism of control. Brutality transformed into routine, legitimized by the military hierarchy. Who was the man who personally executed hundreds of prisoners? How did he become an example of discipline for his army and accused before a foreign court? What fate awaited an executioner turned symbol? The origin of the executioner Gunkichi Tanaka before the war. Gunkichi Tanaka was born in Tokyo in March of 19005 in a Japan undergoing a rapid transformation. The empire, after its victories against China and Russia at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, was consolidating its position as a regional power. The generation to which Tanaka belonged grew up under the influence of a militarism that permeated education, social life, and expectations of young males. The country was advancing towards an industrial and military modernization without precedent. The figure of the soldier became a model of virtue and a pathway for social advancement, especially for middle-class families like Tanaka's. Discipline, absolute obedience to the state and personal sacrifice were presented as pillars of national identity. The basic education he received was marked by the reforms of the Meiji period, which had introduced a strong nationalist component into school curricula. The imperial rescript on education of 1890 had to be memorized in the classrooms and exalted filial loyalty, obedience, and the spirit of self-sacrifice. These principles formed the basis of Tanaka's early indoctrination before his entry into military institutions. Upon completing his preliminary studies, he was admitted to a preparatory academy for officers. These institutions functioned as filters that selected and shaped the future leaders of the imperial army. The regime was severe and based on rigorous physical discipline, intensive academic instruction, and systematic practice of martial arts. Among them, Kendo and Jukendo stood out. Disciplines that reinforced the symbolic bond between Japanese officers and bladed weapons. This emphasis on traditional weapons had a deeper meaning than merely ceremonial. The saber represented the heritage of the samurai ideal reinterpreted for a modern army. Cadets not only learned combat techniques, but also a worldview that positioned Japan in a place of moral and cultural superiority over other Asian peoples. The instruction combined contemporary military strategy with the idea that territorial expansion was in response to a civilizing mission. After this initial stage, Tanaka entered the Imperial Military Academy, the main officer training institution. The first cycle lasting 2 years was conducted in Osaka Saitama Prefecture and combined military instruction with academic studies at a university level. The second cycle in Sagamihara, Kanagawa Prefecture offered more advanced training. During the first period, Tanaka was assigned for 8 months to an active infantry regiment. The objective was to familiarize cadets with standard-issue weapons, platoon tactics, and the internal organization of companies. In that practical experience, Tanaka took on a command role for the first time. Although still in training, he was already treated as superior to the rank-and-file soldiers. This dynamic consolidated the hierarchical distance between officers and troops based on the absolute obedience of the latter and the unquestionable exercise of authority by the former. Back at the academy, he completed the upper cycle of 1 year and 8 months with more demanding training and live ammunition shooting practices. The maneuvers included combat simulations with live fire and hand-to-hand exercises were intensified. The theoretical instruction covered history, geography, and political analysis, always aimed at reinforcing Japanese nationalism. The recent wars against China and Russia were presented as examples of the Japanese ability to prevail over numerically superior forces, thanks to discipline and strategy. The pedagogical purpose was to instill an offensive mindset and the conviction that Japan had a manifest destiny as a leader in Asia. Daily life was governed by an inflexible discipline. The military regulations demanded unquestioning obedience, and physical punishments were used as a corrective method. Group spirit was fostered through collective responsibility so that individual error impacted the entire platoon. This system formed hardened officers ready to fulfill any directive without ethical objections. Upon completing the training, Tanaka received his commission as a second lieutenant after a probationary period in an active regiment. The officer corps enjoyed a privileged social status and was presented as a superior caste-bearer of a national mission. The saber beyond its practical value was a symbol of historical continuity with the samurai tradition. The officers carried it not only as a weapon but as a manifestation of their personal courage and authority. In the case of Tanaka, his saber was christened with the name of Sukahiro, following the custom of giving these weapons their own identity. The Japanese military culture of the interwar period was deeply marked by the reinterpretation of Bushido. The traditional code was adapted to serve the modern state and demanded unwavering loyalty to the emperor, disregard for life when the cause required it, and absence of compassion towards the enemy. The instruction manuals insisted that death in combat was the supreme form of service. In this ideological framework, officers like Tanaka were prepared not only to lead but also to personally execute the most severe orders. His first assignment was in the 45th Infantry Regiment of the 6th Division of the Imperial Army. This unit accumulated experience in operations in China and was considered front-line for offensive campaigns. His incorporation was interpreted as recognition of his performance at the academy and placed him in command position over dozens of soldiers. As a company captain, he had to organize attacks, maintain discipline, and ensure compliance with senior orders. The regiment had experience gained from operations in northern China and Manchuria, facing local irregular forces. That background strengthened their readiness to operate in hostile territory. In the political sphere, Japan was undergoing a radical transformation. In the mid-30s, civilian control had been relegated in favor of the almost absolute influence of the armed forces. After the failed coup of February 1936, the Army and the Navy imposed their expansionist agenda. Convinced that the war against China was inevitable and necessary to secure resources and living space. In this context, Tanaka did not receive technical orders. Only his role as an officer linked him to an expansionist ideology that justified intervention in China as a defense of the vital interests of the empire and as a civilizing mission. The initial promotions within his regiment were due both to military merits and to the ability to rigorously embrace this ideological vision. The culture of promotion rewarded toughness with subordinates, initiative in combat, and the ability to impose absolute authority. Officers who showed hesitation were removed, while those who demonstrated coolness and determination were considered fit to lead in campaigns of conquest. In July of 1937, a confrontation at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing triggered the escalation toward open war between Japan and China. The 45th Infantry Regiment received orders for immediate mobilization. Its first destination was the Shanghai campaign, where the Imperial Army would encounter organized and determined resistance, marking the beginning of a prolonged phase of the conflict in East Asia. Road to war, blood and ashes on the way to Nanking. The confrontation that occurred at the Marco Polo Bridge in July 1937 transformed a series of border skirmishes into an open war between Japan and China. A few weeks later, the Japanese High Command concentrated significant forces in Shanghai, the country's main commercial port and a strategic center for Chiang Kai-shek's government. The city became a military and symbolic target whose conquest was to demonstrate the superiority of the Imperial Army. The battle extended from August to November of that year and became one of the most intense combats of the entire Second Sino-Japanese War. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from both sides participated in it. The 45th Infantry Regiment of the 6th Division, to which Captain Gunkichi Tanaka belonged, was deployed during the first weeks of the campaign. The division had previous experience in operations in northern China and Manchuria. But Shanghai presented a different scenario. Large-scale urban combat with improvised trenches in narrow streets, snipers hidden in civilian buildings, and continuous bombardments that reduced entire neighborhoods to ruins. Unlike other operations in open territory, Shanghai became a prolonged war of attrition. The population density and the existence of foreign concessions complicated military operations. Japanese aviation bombed factories, warehouses, and residential areas, while Chinese forces with limitations of modern weaponry offered a more organized and prolonged resistance than expected. For officers like Tanaka, Shanghai meant the first experience of total urban warfare. The fighting was conducted house by house with the use of grenades and flamethrowers in enclosed spaces supported by heavy artillery to destroy fortified positions. Japanese reports recorded that Chinese resistance exceeded initial estimates, which forced a change in tactics and caused frustration among the imperial troops. As the battle dragged on, the Japanese command adopted measures intended to break the enemy's morale through practices of terror. Summary executions of prisoners became the norm under the premise of avoiding the accumulation of captives that would hinder the mobility of the units. Captured soldiers were eliminated in groups, often in front of other combatants, to reinforce the psychological effect. The seized areas were subjected to organized looting. Shops, warehouses, and homes were emptied with the justification of punishment for resistance. The civilian population trapped in the crossfire also suffered direct assaults from the occupying troops. Brutality became an accepted part of military operations. In that context, Tanaka and the men under his command participated in increasingly ruthless actions against prisoners and civilians. The doctrine transmitted by the High Command insisted that compassion was a tactical weakness and that any captive represented an unacceptable logistical burden. Collective shootings and executions with bayonet were integrated as standard procedures. Over time, these practices became normalized. Units that initially showed reservations ended up adopting them as routine. The weight of orders, the pressure of prolonged combat, and frustration at the Chinese resistance solidified a climate of systematic violence. The battle concluded in November after the general withdrawal of Chinese forces inland. Although Japan gained control of Shanghai, the campaign left tens of thousands of casualties in the Imperial Army, revealing that the war would not follow the pattern of quick victories of previous years. The High Command assessed that to secure future objectives, it was necessary to intensify the methods used in Shanghai. The 6th Division together with the 116th and other units received the order to advance towards Nanjing, the Chinese capital. General Iwan Matsui, commander of the Expeditionary Army, considered it indispensable to take the city to break the resistance of Chiang Kai-shek's government. In Tokyo, this vision was shared. The fall of the capital was to represent not only a tactical victory but a devastating blow to Chinese morale. The march towards Nanjing over several hundreds of kilometers was conducted under the same logic of violence that had characterized the battles in Shanghai. The villages crossed were scenes of executions of civilians accused of collaborating with the enemy. The captured prisoners were eliminated immediately to maintain the pace of the advance. On numerous occasions, entire villages were set on fire either as retaliation or to deny resources to possible retreating Chinese forces. The distinction between combatants and civilian population blurred until it disappeared. In rural areas, the inhabitants were treated as potentially hostile, which justified preventive measures of extreme violence. Tanaka, in command of his company, participated in these operations. The reports of his unit document encounters with remnants of Chinese units, followed by systematic executions of the captured. The violence had been fully integrated into daily procedures reproducing the pattern established in Shanghai. Elimination of prisoners, suppression of any sign of resistance, and continuous advance without regard for humanitarian considerations. The orders transmitted by Matsui were explicit. The conquest of Nanjing had to be achieved using any necessary means. The High Command conceived the operation as a demonstration of the inevitability of imperial victory. Although the Chinese army was weakened and in retreat, the defense of the capital still posed an obstacle that was intended to be overcome through the systematic application of terror. During the march, the distance between the actions of the Japanese army and international standards of military conduct definitively widened. Executions of prisoners, looting, and indiscriminate violence against civilians ceased to be exceptions to become practices tolerated and even encouraged by officers of different levels. Tanaka and his regiment, hardened by months of urban combat and accustomed to the use of terror as a tactic, arrived on the outskirts of Nanking in December of 1937. The capital showed evident signs of collapse. Tens of thousands of refugees had gathered in the city. The defending army was disorganized and the central government had evacuated to Wuhan. The conditions were ripe for the practices learned in Shanghai to be expressed with greater intensity during the siege that was about to begin. The fall of Nanking. The capital surrendered to death. On the 9th of December of 1937, Japanese forces reached the outskirts of Nanking, the capital of the Republic of China, government headquarters since the late 1920s, was surrounded by walls of great extent and height. But the internal military situation made a sustainable defense unlikely. The army commanded by Tang Shengshi consisted of tens of thousands of poorly equipped and demoralized men after the retreat from Shanghai, while the deployed Japanese divisions outnumbered the defenders 2-1 and had heavy artillery, aviation, and recent experience in urban combat. That same day, the Japanese High Command issued an ultimatum. Flyers dropped from the air demanded immediate surrender and warned that if not yielded in 24 hours, the city would be subjected to a total offensive.